Hey, welcome to the show. Today we're going to talk about something that was in a Zoltan Pozsar report that I read this morning about the m-CBDC bridge, why it's significant, what it actually is, and how it's really signaling to all of us that the future of money is right around the corner. Hello, I'm Molly Elmore. Today we're going to talk about central bank digital currencies. And in reference to a report I read from an analyst named Zoltan Pozsar this morning. So first of all, CBDCs is a complex topic. And I certainly have done my share of posts and videos expressing kind of the dystopian concerns that many of us, myself included, have with a certain type of CBDC. Those are referred to as a direct retail CBDC, where the central bank issues money directly to the people, and it can be programmed and connected to other databases. Lots of concerns about that. That's not what we're going to talk about today. That dystopian thing that I used to be quite worried about, I'm becoming increasingly less worried about due to the logistics of how difficult it is to implement something like that and how we've been kind of lied to by the media in terms of its development. So that aside, today we're going to talk about something that is less juicy in one regard, but more significant in another regard. So CBDC simply means a central bank digital currency. It just means a currency that is digital in nature, that is issued directly by the central bank. Not terribly different, to be totally honest, than our current monetary system of fiat that's issued by the central bank. The only real difference is that it's being issued using blockchain technology, which allows the value to be sent or transferred very quickly via the blockchain. Now, the CBDC stuff that we're going to talk about today is primarily, if not exclusively, about money that's sent from like one bank to another bank. And none of the dystopian concerns about CBDCs have anything to do with how banks send money to other banks. They're not using smart contracts to like manipulate each other, or control each other, or whatever. So the stuff that we're talking about here is actually very innovative and forward-thinking and is not related to some of the more specific and dark concerns around CBDCs. All right, first I want to share with you a quote, two quotes actually, from Zoltan Pozsar. He definitely wins the award for the analyst with the coolest name. He is an analyst for Credit Suisse, and he writes reports that get picked up pretty regularly by the sort of financial press and other podcasters and whatnot. I was fortunate enough to get a copy of this recent report, and I wanted to read to you some elements from it. The context of this report is he likes to talk about the future of money being a return to asset-backed currencies that he thinks are going to be tied to commodities or other types of assets like energy, gold. And he covers geopolitical arrangements. I mean, this is right up my alley. And in this report, he's talking about some moves from China to sort of move towards this new monetary system where assets now have a different type of value. They're kind of more like money. They're being used to trade. They're being used to back specific currencies. I've done some other videos on this. And my interview with Jimmy Valley that was up yesterday covers this as well. All right, so here's an excerpt from Zoltan's report. He's actually referencing a speech from President Xi of China at the China GCC summit, which was fairly recently, I think. In the next 3 to 5 years, China is ready to work with GCC countries in the following priority areas. First, setting up a new paradigm of all-dimensional energy cooperation, where China will continue to import large quantities of crude oil on a long-term basis from GCC countries and purchase more LNG, liquid natural gas. We will strengthen our cooperation in the upstream sector, engineering services, as well as downstream storage, transportation, and refinery. The Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange platform will be fully utilized for RMB settlement in oil and gas trade. RMB is the Chinese currency. And we could start currency swap cooperation and advance the m-CBDC bridge project. That is what we're here to talk about today, is this m-CBDC bridge project, which is a bit of a tongue twister mouthful. And it's significant in that we have a world leader referencing this in a public speech. So up until now, we've seen press releases from the BIS and industry groups kind of talking about this being tested. It's a different thing, in my opinion, when you now have a global world leader announcing this from the stage. We are doing this. All right, quote number 2. President Xi's 3 to 5 year horizon means that by 2025, the GCC may be paid in renminbi for all of the oil and gas that they have been shipping east to China. Fourth, plumbing references in Xi's speech add further gravity to the above. When was the last time you heard a head of state talk about swap lines and central bank digital currencies? And not just any CBDC, but a specific one, and in quotes, the m-CBDC Bridge Project. The m-CBD Bridge Project, or as the BIS likes to refer to it, the Project MBridge, is a masterclass in plumbing undertaken by the People's Bank of China, the Bank of Thailand, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Central Bank of the UAE. The project enables real-time, peer-to-peer, cross-border, and foreign exchange transactions using CBDCs and does so without involving the US dollar or network of Western correspondent banks that the US dollar system runs on. Pretty interesting, no? So I would agree that this is significant because we are now, in my opinion, moving from talking about this stuff to actually implementing it at scale. I don't think global leaders like Xi talk about things that they're not serious about. It's a big deal to announce to the world that we are now exchanging assets like oil in currencies outside of the dollar system. This is the end of the petrodollar. I've talked about this before. This is not breaking news. But what is exciting is to see world leaders talk about how they're now going to be using blockchain assets to settle. It further confirms this movement away from the SWIFT system and away from correspondent banks towards a more innovative technological solution to pay your bills. This has implications, obviously, for the sale of oil. Ever since the 1970s, oil has pretty much been sold in dollars only. And that benefits some people. Some people like to think that all Americans benefit from that. I actually don't agree. I think it had a really devastating impact within the United States on the manufacturing sector because it made the dollar so strong that a lot of U.S. products were not able to compete. And as a result, much manufacturing moved overseas, which cost a lot of blue-collar jobs. There are certain areas, especially in the middle of the United States, that were absolutely devastated financially from this exodus of manufacturing. So while a great many people in the United States became wealthy, and there was an overall kind of lifting of prosperity, not everybody benefited from that. So just there's that. The second thing I think that's huge is that we're no longer going to have this unipolar world where the controllers of the dollar, who may not even be American, to be totally frank, are now, they're not in charge anymore. It's going to likely impact the role of the U.S. military globally. The military doesn't have to be the cop on the beat telling every other country which policies, political, social, etc., to pursue. This group who controls the dollar, who may or may not be American, we're still kind of uncovering their identity. They may have strong connections to certain industries like weapons manufacturing, also known as the military industrial complex. This group tends to find war and conflicts very profitable. And it is likely, or at least possible, that certain conflicts have been manufactured for the purposes of profit, and this dollar system has been used to enable all of that. So I'm a fan of peace. I don't particularly like people being shot and killed for profit. I think that's horrible and gross. So my hope is that this movement away from this unipolar system towards one that is multipolar, sorry to use all these sort of jargony buzzwords, but what it simply means is that we're not just going to have one currency anymore. So you're not going to have one group in charge. And the most interesting thing about this departure from this one group is, who was this one group? It's easy to just say it's the US government, but there are multiple factions within the US government. Some of those factions may be managed or controlled by behind the scenes players that are kind of part of the permanent state that we don't really know much about. Their nationality, I think, is irrelevant. I think what is more important is their priorities and their concerns. I've talked a bit in this channel about this war between Davos and the Fed, and how it looks like there are multiple factions, even within the financial world, that are not in agreement. And if you step back and try to look at this at a big picture, and you tie in the BRICS nations and their desire to trade with each other in a currency of their choosing without using a system that has political control mechanisms in it, what it really looks like to me from the big stage is that all of the colonies of the real old money of the world are revolting at once. It's a pretty exciting time. This MBridge technology is a way for these other countries to trade with each other outside the dollar system and using a more innovative technology, the blockchain, to settle. You don't have to rely on this old school banking network that ties back to these old nobility families who in history were colonizers and created colonies across all continents of the world. They also have a pretty strong connection to these correspondent banks. So it's connected, it's tied. At least this is my take on it. And so if we see these former colonies, and China was a colony. Sometimes these colonies weren't all that successful. I know Russia, there was many attempts at the Europeans to colonize Russia, quite unsuccessfully. Some people refer to the USSR as a failed European colony experiment. The United States obviously was. Canada and Australia and New Zealand are still, in some regards, colonies of the Crown, the British Crown. And we have had issues across the Middle East and Africa and South America with these various European entities colonizing parts of the world. The thing that kind of sucks to be a colonist is that usually you don't get a whole lot of benefit from it, right? This wealthy, powerful group comes in, they say, hey, we kind of own you now, and you're going to have to pay us 50% of whatever it is you do. And if you don't do what we say, bad things will happen, like we'll kill you. Generally, colonists put up with this for a while, and over time, there's some kind of revolt. Now, the interesting thing is that I was taught in school that, like, in 1776, the American colonists rose up and revolted against the British oppression, and then we had this war, and the Americans won, and now everything's been all hunky-dory ever since. There is a counter viewpoint that sometimes when these conflicts appear to end and one party appears to be victorious, that may not really be the case. I've spent quite a bit of time the last couple of weeks studying more about World War II history, and I think we've been misled as well about what really happened in the end of the war and who was victorious. I think that also could be the case with the Revolutionary War in the United States. All right, so why am I rattling on and babbling about all this stuff that happened a long, long time ago? Is if you see many of these BRICS members and the Fed, the US, as colonists who have zero interest at this point in being subservient to this old money cartel, it starts to make sense why we're seeing some alliances that might not appear to fit, why we're seeing a shift away from the dollar and movement towards this new monetary system. While it's kind of presented as a more level playing field, and I think that's great marketing label, there's another take on this in that this is a revolt of sorts, and that the nations of the world want to be independent of this colonizer influence. And this colonizer influence may not like have explicit colonies like they used to, but entities like the IMF and the World Bank, they kind of get the same result when they give loans to emerging markets. The group that controls part of the US government that dishes out lots of foreign aid, that's not really done because like people are really nice and generous. That's done as a way to buy favor. We see a lot of money move globally as you can call them bribes or payoffs or influence efforts. I think the result is still the same, is that the person who's dishing out a lot of money gets things in return for that. So if we were to move away from that system, well, the question is, well, what would be next? How would you replace that? We still have to trade, and people still need food and oil and to heat their homes and cars and all that stuff. So if we don't have this sort of centralized fiat system that revolves around the dollar, what do we have instead? We would probably move to more sound money that's asset backed. In history, this was referred to as the gold standard, when gold, a physical asset, was considered money. Well, gold is great, but what if a variety of assets could fall under that label? Maybe silver, oil, some other types of commodities, things that are hold their value and could be traded, but you don't necessarily want to physically trade those things. So you would use a central bank digital currency that is backed by these assets as a way to trade with each other. Well, if I'm country A and I have my asset-backed currency, and you're country B and you have your asset-backed currency, well, and we want to trade with each other, that's awesome. But like, I don't need currency B when I'm doing great with currency A. So we have this sort of trade problem in that I want your widgets, but you don't want my currency. And this is where m-CBDC bridge comes into place. This is also sort of the value offer behind XRP as a cross-border payments currency. And even XDC as a trade settlement currency kind of fits into this big picture, that instead of having one global currency that everybody buys and sells stuff in, what if the world could have a variety of different currencies, and they're all no longer backed by the faith and military of a particular government. They're not going to be IOUs where we're just saying we're good for it. They're going to be backed by some type of tokenized asset. But you need to have a way for this multipolar world to trade with each other. And this is where the m-CBDC bridge comes into. M stands for multi. So we're going to have in this multipolar world, multiple central bank digital currencies, multiple asset-backed currencies that countries can trade with each other, with the understanding that I don't necessarily want to hold my profit or whatever in your currency. So I need a way to be able to trade and settle. Now, what was significant in this Zoltan paper, and I've read this elsewhere, is that China is now accepting payment for oil in yuan. But necessarily require you to keep that. So you can then turn that profit into gold. So they're allowing the money that you receive to be easily converted into an asset. And this was actually the deal with the dollar a long time ago, from 1933 up until 1971. If you were a country and you held dollars and you decided at any point in time that you wanted to redeem those dollars for gold, you could do that. Now, the problem was that the US government spent more money than they had gold, or they printed more money than they had gold, and they spent it on things like the Vietnam War and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So all of a sudden now there wasn't enough gold in reserves to cash out all the dollars. So the question I think that we'll have to find out with this new version of it is, will these governments be more responsible this time around? Meaning they're not going to be issuing more tokens than there are assets. This is kind of also referred to as paper gold, where you have these poker chips that don't correspond to the actual asset that it backs. Maybe the blockchain will prevent that from being as much of a problem. Maybe society has learned. Maybe cycles will repeat itself, and 80 years from now, the same problem will happen. But I think in the short term, over the next 5 to 10 years, it looks like we really are moving back to sound money. And sound money meaning that it's backed by assets. The government or a central bank can't just print money whenever they want. And this MBridge, they call it MBridge. It's also called m-CBDC bridge. This is a significant move in that it's actually happening. Like, China's stating, we're doing this, and it's going to happen over the next couple of years. Now, the question that a lot of people ask is, which assets will be used? Will it be XRP? Will it be XDC or something else? My take as of now is I think it'll be many of them. I don't think there needs to be one asset to rule them all. We sort of saw with this unipolar world that when you have one thing that's the center of everything, that can create some issues. So what if there was room for multiple assets to be used as bridge currencies, with the realization that when you think about how many assets get traded and how many assets have value, we're talking in quadrillions of dollars, multiple quadrillions of dollars. I mean, think about it. Not only do we have gold, we have all the other precious metals, we have all the oil, potentially other forms of energy. Then we have real estate. We have the stock market. So these are all sort of shares in companies. We have the bond market, which are these sort of loans to governments. I'm not really sure how the bond market's going to change, by the way, when we move away from this credit system towards asset-backed. But let's assume there is a bond market of sorts, because governments still need money to pay for stuff. And then we have this massive world of the derivatives market, which is huge, because derivatives are simply assets that are derived from something else. And there's an infinite number of things you could derive. They're sort of also known as side bets. And we also have, what else do we have? That's all I can think off the top of my head. But when you add up all of these categories, it's huge. So there is plenty of opportunity for multiple digital assets to be used to facilitate those exchanges. It doesn't just have to be XRP or XDC. They both can survive and thrive and dramatically increase in value, because they become now the facilitators of huge amounts of value being moved. I mean, if you even just think about one of these assets being used to do settlement for just the New York Stock Exchange, like, that's huge. But think about how many stock exchanges there are around the world, and how these markets continue to grow over time. The potential is absolutely massive. So one thing I liked about Zoltan Pozsar's viewpoint is he really does see this movement towards commodity-based money, asset-backed currencies, similar kind of idea, and that the idea is to take away this centralization of power in the hands of the issuer of the US dollar. He doesn't really get into who really controls those purse strings. It's easy to just, as I said, label the US government as that, but exactly are we talking about, and who pays for a lot of the people who are acting like the quarterback of the football team, who really is the owner of that team. We still are kind of working to uncover that. So don't assume that there's this one group of US government that all kind of colludes together. I do really believe there are multiple factions within there, and then there are the people behind the scenes. So if you were to move towards this multipolar world, you kind of dethrone this centralized entity that controls this one currency. It'll probably affect life as we know it in many ways. I'm actually of the viewpoint now that it's going to take a long time for many of these things to change. Like to put real estate on the blockchain, for example, is going to be a big project. I mean, there's so many deeds, property records across the globe that to digitize all of those is going to take a while. And even the supply chain, trade finance stuff, which I've done some videos about. I mean, there's so many agreements and ports and shipping companies and middlemen involved. Like to move all of that to the blockchain is a massive project. But it's exciting. We are seeing now China's official announcement that trade is now being done outside the dollar system, and they're going to be using these multiple CBDC currencies to facilitate trade. So it's an exciting time to be alive. And all right. If you found this video helpful, please like it. Helps me with YouTube. And we'll see you in the next video.